Hello everyone, this is Robert and welcome to the final assembly video for the LXmini speakers. If you're unfamiliar with what that project is, check the link down below. I have a nice overview. This is a project that's sponsored by Matter Hackers, so check out that link down below as well. Thank you Matter Hackers once again for all the lovely filament. In this video we're going to be doing the final assembly, getting these things fully working and done, fully built. The only other videos I'll be doing further from this will be like kind of tuning, listening impressions, things like that, but that'll be down the road. So let's get these things built. I have all the pieces 3D printed, and I even have a couple little last minute design changes. Well, you'll see what these are in the future. Feel free to use the chapters to skip around, and let's get started. The first step is to remove the supports off of the lower housing piece. This is the only piece that needed supports. The top housing can be printed without it. The little arm at the top, those are totally fine, but the bottom piece has some supports. And what I found with Nylon X is there's a fine line between the support interface settings. You can either get it to where it just 100% adheres and it's impossible to remove, or you can get it to where it just pops right off, but the underneath side of the surface, you know, the underneath side of where the support was, that surface finish is really poor. So I opted for, you know, something kind of in the middle. I think these are just kind of the default settings, maybe with a little bit more of a gap, and it does come off cleanly. I had to use a chisel in a couple places just to kind of make sure it came off really clean, but the underneath side is really nice. Now this is important because the access panel is going to be here. I am going to use kind of a foam gasket, but I do want this surface as clean as possible or as smooth as possible. Also, you have the support on the underneath side of the legs, and you don't really want that to be too gnarly because, you know, the legs are going to be snugged up against it, and you want that relatively clean as well. But with a little bit of patience, a sharp chisel, it all comes off and it looks really nice. The next step is to add the threaded inserts. I usually like to use the deburring tool just to kind of break the edge on all these parts. Depending on how good I did the model, sometimes it'll kind of bubble up around the edges and leave a little bit of you know, excess goo up top. But if you do a little bit of deburring, it will lessen that to some degree. So there's a lot of threaded inserts in this model. We have the top housing, which has 5 for the actual driver, or 6, I don't know, you're seeing it. And then we also have 4 in the little arm that connects the tweeter assembly to the main driver housing. And then we have on the bottom, there's 12, 2 for each leg, 3 legs, 6, and then you have another 6 for the access panel on the bottom. Now, I don't use any special jig. I see a lot of the YouTubers have these little, like, you know, mini drill press looking things, and I've kind of looked into those several times, and I found that most of the parts I'm doing are too big for that. I also don't need another tool, you know, I don't know really where that would set. So I just use my soldering iron, and yeah, I even just use a soldering iron tip. I don't even have a fancy tip on there, and I found that to be just fine. It's, you know, you do a dozen of them and you kind of get it down and you know how they work. It's relatively easy to get them lined up perfectly as long as you have the right dimensions and the right holes. Once it starts to melt, it will just kind of fall down into the hole, and then you have a couple seconds afterwards to kind of make some small adjustments if it's not perfectly lined up. So yeah, I don't really have one of those, and I don't really even know where I'd put it right now. So the only thing left to do before we start assembling this whole top section is to add some foam on the underneath side of the driver. We need this whole thing to be sealed up since this is actually a sealed enclosure. So we're just adding some of this, I think it's 1/16 inch thick, 1/4 inch wide foam gasket. It's you know, speaker gasket material, and it bends really nicely around there. So once we bend it around there, we just kind of have to cut out little sections for the screw clearances, and it should be good to go. And then we can actually move on to assembling the whole head assembly, and then later doing the whole bottom assembly. In the beginning, I said that I made a last-minute design change, and it's right here. So I'm adding these little rings just kind of for an aesthetic accent. If you look at the transition here with the ring, kind of cool. And if we look at the other side without the ring, it just, I don't know, it didn't work for me. It just kind of looked a little bit unfinished. And my wife actually pointed this out, and we tried a couple different things. I actually tried these in a lot of different colors. This kind of matches the aluminum cones and the aluminum feet, and ends up making it look a lot more finished and a lot more like a commercial product. So, yep. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take this head, we're going to fix that on permanently, then we're going to put in the driver, then put in the rest, flip it over, and do the bottom. For attaching this, this might be a little controversial, but I'm just going to use tape on the inside for right now. I'm still not 100% sure if these are exactly the way I want them to be, and once this is all glued up, that's going to be a problem. So I'm just going to use some very thick gaffer's tape for right now, and that should actually seal it and hold everything together just fine. So let's do that. If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know that me taping something together is pretty unusual, but I felt for this application it was the right course of action. With glue, I'm a little bit worried that these mating surfaces aren't going to be tight fit enough to get a good seal. This needs to be 100% sealed from any air leaks because this is a sealed chamber. The tape will give me that. The glue I'm not so sure about, especially with these spacer rings. There's kind of more interfaces in there. Obviously, I could pick a glue that kind of expands and fills in those gaps. The other thing I was concerned about was I really don't want to get any glue on any of these exterior finishes for the 3D printed parts or the painted parts. It's not going to really wipe off. It's going to be there. So if I'm using super glue, if you've ever used super glue, you know that it gets on your fingers every single time. There's no way to avoid it. Every single time it drips somewhere, it gets on your hands. And if that happens once with one of these 3D printed parts, that's just going to be a spot there. So yeah, it's a little bit of that. I probably could have taped it off or done something like that, but I'm just using tape for now, and I'm going to sleep at night perfectly fine. So now that the head is taped on, we can attach the tweeter assembly. And I put this together off camera because I ran the wire through it. The wire actually goes through this 3D printed arm and out the back. And once you put on the connectors, it doesn't pull back out. So it's assembled, but there's just 2 screws from the inside that connect down into here, and then these 2 fasteners connect into here. So I'm going to go ahead and feed this in and attach it. And this is kind of a weird assembly because we actually need to attach this, but not the driver, because then this driver goes in and then that driver goes in. So it's a whole thing. So let's get this all hooked up. The majority of what I build out here in the shop is combat robots, and combat robots are very durable. And not surprisingly, speakers are not as durable. So with combat robots, I'm used to, you know, something rolling off the bench, falling on the floor, you know, putting a screwdriver through it, whatever. But with a speaker, I've got to be very, very careful. And I've had a whole dedicated section in my shop, the whole build for these, because the drivers are much more fragile than anything else I'm usually working on. So anyway, but there is kind of an order of operations, as I explained earlier. The wire for the tweeter needs to come through the whole head assembly, but it can't be attached. If the tweeter is attached, then the main driver can't really go in. So you kind of need to have both in place, but also not in place. And here you can kind of see me fiddling with it a little bit. Getting that first screw in is always a little bit tricky, but once the mid-bass or bass driver is in place, then it's a little bit easier. And I decided to take it off the workbench and actually stand it up. This is a little sketchy because at this point the speaker is extremely top heavy. There's really only weight in the very top, and it's kind of cantilevered up, and so any little bump will just make this come crashing down, and then I just have to throw it all in the trash and start over. But yeah, everything went together just fine. Everything is Loctited in place, as you can see me doing, and yeah, whole top is now assembled. So the top section of the speaker is done. Now we need to move on to the bottom. First thing I'm doing is just taping the wires in place just so they don't move around too much and rattle, things like that. And then it's time to stuff the inside of the speaker. This is acoustic stuffing. It's used in pretty much every speaker out there, and the kit and plans call for a specified amount to be kind of shoved down this inner chamber. You got to think of the bottom section of the speaker kind of like a subwoofer. It is a sealed chamber with the woofer on the top. So this is a sealed volume, and the acoustic stuffing is there just to kind of damp everything and make sure that the waveforms don't get too crazy. So we're just going to stuff that in, and I could have put the bottom section on first, but whatever, I did it in this order for whatever reason. Once we get the appropriate amount of stuffing in there, now I'm going to put on that cosmetic trim ring that I talked about earlier, put that on, and then we can put on the bottom. You might notice that there's some blue painter's tape along the bottom of the PVC section, and that is just there to fill up the gap between the lip on the PVC and the bottom 3D printed piece. They fit a little bit looser than I would have liked, but with the painter's tape they fit nice and snug. And then once that's on there, we're just going to tape it up the exact same way that we did the top section. Before the bottom section actually gets taped, I need to make sure that it is lined up with the top section. So the top section has that arm that comes out the back for the tweeter, and that needs to be lined up in the same plane as the connector that comes out the back, just so, you know, the legs and everything, it all looks appropriate. So I'm just kind of using a dowel here to kind of eyeball it. This doesn't have to be like absolutely perfect, but those two things need to be lined up, and then I can tape it all in place. Before I make all the final connections, I'm just going to do a quick polarity test, and I'm doing this just throwing on some alligator clips. There's a white wire that denotes the positive, and then the other one is the negative. So I'm just going to throw on some alligator clips, watch the speaker cones, and then touch it to a AA battery. And for the top tweeter / full range, it should move out towards the listener, and for the mid bass driver it should move up. So I'm just kind of, you know, touching it, seeing if it moves in the right direction, and then I'm good to go to put on the connector. I'm actually pretty proud of how this little speaker terminal thing came out. This is just a 4-pole speak-on connector, which is made for active powered speakers such as this one. And I have a little bit of tape, once again, wrapped around it just to kind of fill up that little void between this and the 3D print. Slide that inside, it's very, very snug. And then there's this little cover plate that screws onto the front of it and ends up for a really clean look. And the speaker cable will just click and lock right in place. So now we're at the fun part, because this is the last part. All we need to do now is put on the legs, the access panel, and then the kind of bottom brace thing, and we are done. I'm starting with the legs. They attach internally. There's a 1/4 screw that goes on the inside, and then they also attach from the bottom. So you have 3 connection points for each one of these legs. And I did learn over the process of kind of prototyping these that they're relatively heavy, and it will make the speaker want to spin when you have it like this. So I am starting with the bottom one and then moving on to the other 2, and once again Loctiting every fastener. Once we have the legs in, I can put the bottom access panel. You can see there's already a foam gasket in there. I put that in at some other point of time. But yeah, there's a little foam gasket, and this fits pretty darn tight. It is really tricky to kind of get it snugged up inside of there. But once that's in, we've got 6 more fasteners. And once that's done, now we can put on this bottom brace. And I showed a lot of this in the previous video, so I'm not going into a lot of detail, but the brace really, really helps. I was kind of surprised on how much it stiffened up that bottom. The legs, once again, are relatively heavy. The plastic is relatively thin, and so it would kind of bend them out a little bit, but with this brace, it works perfectly. And then that's all there is to it. Okay, I spoke too soon. There are the carpet spikes. There's 3 carpet spikes, which is really annoying because these are usually only sold in sets of 4, so I had to buy 2 sets of 4, and I have 2 left over, but it's fine. So I'm going to put in the carpet spikes. This theoretically allows for a little bit of adjustment where you could kind of lean them back or tilt them forward, something like that, but I'm just bottoming them all out and then tightening the nut in place. It'll be totally fine. I don't need to do any kind of tilt adjustment on these. And it does make it sit up a little bit. We have relatively plush carpet up at the cabin, so this will be absolutely perfect. While my clone finishes the other speaker, I'm going to work on the speaker cables. I feel like I could rename this project There's Just One More Step, because I think I've said that at every single step. But because this uses the speak-on connectors, this needs a custom 4-pole speaker cable. I had some old AudioQuest speaker cable in a bin. I have a lot of bins and I have a lot of stuff in these bins. So I pulled that out and I'm going to make some custom speaker cables with the speak-on connectors. So pretty simple. I really like these connectors. I like having that satisfying click. Like banana plugs are fine and spade lugs are fine, but it's kind of nice to just have this twist lock connector. This is going to be probably my preferred connector on any other future speaker builds if I ever do any other speaker builds, and it ends up looking really nice and really finished. So let's get these on the speakers. I'll show you kind of how everything connects. I'll give some little beauty shots, and then we can actually take a listen to some royalty-free music that I'll never actually listen to. So of course I'm going to do one of those nice slow panning shots to give you a better idea what these whole things look like when they're finished before we bring them into the listening room. But just kind of wanted to show you the back, show you the connector and how the speak-on clicks in. Look at that, how nice is that? Just pull the tab, pull it out. Nice and simple. So now we'll do the slow pan shot and then we can listen to some music and I can be done with these. Well, they're finally finished, and let me know down below what you think. I think my wife was right. The little accent rings ended up looking really, really nice, and it makes them look a lot more finished. I wished I had taken a video of what they looked like without it, but without it, they just kind of looked like they needed something. It just didn't quite look finished, and this also helps with the transition between the painted PVC pipe and the 3D printed plastic. The transition is a lot less jarring and kind of more natural with that little trim ring. There's probably a couple little things left to do. Technically, you're supposed to have some stuffing in the upper tweeter housing, but I'm going to design some kind of like cover plate so it's not just, you know, stuffing hanging out the back, but that is for another day and that's really not critical. I can do that at any time. So yeah, that's what these look like. Let's go play some music through them. Hello everyone, welcome to my living room. So this is where I'm going to be demoing the speakers. This isn't going to be their final home. They're going to go up to our cabin up in the mountains, but I'm going to test them out here for a little bit. I'm probably going to do, you know, some listening impressions and stuff like that in a separate video. I got to get them tuned for the space, all that good stuff. But unfortunately, this stuff is really difficult because I can only use royalty-free music, so I can't really pick anything that I know, and I don't personally listen to a bunch of royalty-free music, so it's kind of hard to go out and find stuff, but I'll find something to play. So what we got going on back here is, let me scoot this way. So we've got the controller sitting right there, hooked up to the speakers right there and there. And then my normal system is over here, which is Wilson Audio Sasha's, connected to a NAD M33 integrated amp thing, and that sounds pretty good. So it's a really difficult comparison. I actually might play the same tracks back to back just to kind of, I don't know, if you can tell anything on camera. But yeah, speakers are done. They look pretty neat in the space. They're going to be really nice in the cabin because it's a relatively small space. This is a pretty large room. What you can't see is it's got large vaulted ceilings, stuff like that. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this build. There's maybe something to be taken away from it. I really do like these speakers. They're very different, and I'll get into that kind of in the final listening impressions. They do sound quite small compared to the Sasha's, but I mean, 250-pound speakers versus little, you know, speakers made with a PVC pipe. They're obviously going to sound different, but as far as openness, not sounding boxy, a lot of speakers to me, especially compared to the Wilson, sound very boxy, very closed in, very like that. They sound very open, have a big sound stage, sound very natural. They've got all that good stuff going for them, but they can't rock out like the Wilsons can. But you know, there's just not really a good comparison between those two. They're very, very different speakers. But I'll play some stuff for you, and thanks for watching. See you in the next video.